Behind the blazing guitar solos and unforgettable stage performances, there was a man who redefined rock and roll and died with almost nothing to his name. Jimi Hendrix, the Seattle-born guitar god who changed music forever, left behind more than just legendary riffs. He left behind an abandoned home, a tangled legacy, and a haunting question. How could someone so iconic die so broke, so young, and so alone? In this video, we step inside Jimi Hendrix's abandoned house, unravel the truth behind his shockingly low net worth, and revisit the tragic final days of a man whose talent lit the world on fire, before fading out at just 27. From purple haze to personal pain, this is the untold story of the legend we thought we knew. How much was the guitar legend worth at the time of his death? Of all the rock legends who left us too soon, few are missed as deeply as Jimi Hendrix. The Seattle-born guitar genius was just beginning to scratch the surface of his talent when he died in 1970 at the age of 27. Many extraordinary guitarists have come and gone since, but none has unseated Hendrix from the top of the list. His time in the spotlight was brief, astonishingly so. While most major 60s rock bands built expansive discographies, Hendrix only released 4 albums, one of them live, before his untimely death. Compared to Led Zeppelin's output before John Bonham's passing or The Doors' discography before losing Jim Morrison, Hendrix's catalog is strikingly short. Still, every single album he released was a massive hit during his lifetime. The 3 studio albums Hendrix recorded with The Experience, featuring Noel Redding on bass and Mitch Mitchell on drums, were all commercial successes. But it was their debut, Are You Experienced, 1967, that became the crown jewel. Packed with classics like Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, Hey Joe, and Fire, the album sold over 5 million copies and spent more than 2 years on the Billboard charts, peaking at number 1. 5. Although his later albums reached even higher positions, Electric Ladyland hit number 1 in 1968 and stayed on the charts for 40 weeks. None matched the debut's long-term sales impact. In total, Hendrix's albums have sold over 30 million copies worldwide. Even as record sales soared and his concerts drew massive crowds, Hendrix had another income stream: songwriting royalties. But tragically, at the time he died, he just had a shockingly low net worth. Jimi Hendrix had a net worth of just $20,000 at the time of his death in 1970. That's the same as around $150,000 today after adjusting for inflation. Had he lived, his fortune would almost certainly have grown dramatically, fueled by ongoing album sales and sold-out tours. And those sales never stopped. When legal disputes over his estate flared up in 2004, Court TV reported that it was worth an estimated $80 million. Since then, posthumous releases and reissues have continued to generate revenue, pushing the estate's value to as much as $175 million by 2019. That may not reach Paul McCartney's financial stratosphere, but for any rock musician, it's an extraordinary legacy. The sad truth, though, is that what Hendrix achieved in just a few short years can never truly be replicated. There's no second coming of Jimi. His blend of raw talent, creativity, and soul was a once-in-a-lifetime force, and the music world still hasn't found anyone quite like him, who inherited Jimi Hendrix's money after he died. Decades after Jimi Hendrix's death, his estate remains the center of ongoing legal disputes. When Hendrix passed away in 1970, he hadn't left a will, which meant his entire fortune went to his father, Al Hendrix. At the time, estate attorney Leo Branton was brought in to manage the finances, and Al began receiving income from Jimi's royalties. Not long after, Al made the controversial decision to sell the distribution rights to his son's music. However, after a lengthy legal battle, he was eventually able to regain control of those rights. When Al died in 2002, his will left the estate in the hands of his adopted stepdaughter, Jimi Hendrix. This sparked a bitter family feud. Jimi's brother Leon Hendrix contested the will, claiming he had been unfairly cut out due to Janie's influence. But in 2007, the court dismissed Leon's challenge. Since then, legal conflicts have continued, particularly surrounding the use of Jimi's name and image. As of 2025, Hendrix's estate is valued at around $175 million. It is currently managed by two companies, Authentic Hendrix and Experience Hendrix, both founded by Al and now operated by Jimi Hendrix. And that only adds another layer of heartbreak to an already tragic life for Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix's tragic real-life story. Ask anyone what comes to mind when they hear the name Jimi Hendrix, and you'll likely hear the same things. Velvet jackets, Woodstock, psychedelic colors, LSD, and, of course, the word guitarist, usually with greatest in history attached. Hendrix crafted an image that became legendary, and because his life was cut short, that image has remained frozen in time, untouched, iconic, and unchallenged. But behind the myth was a man who carried deep scars. What many people don't know is that Hendrix's life was marked by hardship long before the fame. His childhood was shaped by instability and abuse. His adulthood, by addiction, violence, and a constant battle with inner demons. The powerful presence he projected on stage and the soul-shaking sound of his guitar often masked a troubled soul struggling just to stay afloat. From a painful beginning to a tragic end, this is the real story of Jimi Hendrix. Not just the legend, but the man. A man whose brilliance burned bright, and all too briefly, as perhaps the most extraordinary musician of the 20th century. Jimi Hendrix had an absent father. Jimi Hendrix was born as Johnny Allen Hendrix in Seattle during World War II. His father, Al Hendrix, had just married his mother, Lucille, when he was drafted into the Army, only 3 days after their wedding. Lucille was already pregnant when Al was sent off to serve. Assigned to guard airfields for the U.S. Army Air Forces, Al requested leave to be with his wife for the birth of their child. But because his unit was stationed too far from Seattle, his request was denied. When he pushed to see her anyway, he was placed in the stockade to prevent him from going AWOL and was held there for over a month, without being formally charged or tried. While Al was away, newborn Johnny was cared for by his maternal grandmother, Clarice. Lucille, meanwhile, became increasingly difficult to reach, and young Johnny was passed from one caretaker to another. It wasn't until 1945, 3 years later, that Al returned from the war and met his son for the first time. Suspicious that Johnny Allen might be the name of a man Lucille had been involved with, Al changed his son's name to James Marshall Hendrix. How Jimi Hendrix sheltered from his parents' battles. Al and Lucille's marriage was anything but peaceful. While Al had tried to file for divorce during his time in the military, he ultimately decided to give the relationship another chance when he returned to the U.S. in 1945. But the reunion didn't bring stability. Their home life was marked by constant arguments, often fueled by heavy drinking and all-night parties, leaving James and his younger brother Leon caught in the chaos. According to Leon, their father never physically harmed Lucille, but she had a fiery temper when she drank. If she was angry, she wouldn't hesitate to lash out, sometimes using whatever object was within reach. James and Leon quickly learned to sense when a fight was about to erupt. They'd hide in a closet together, waiting for the shouting and clatter to die down. Eventually, Lucille left the home for good, and in 1951, Al filed for divorce and was granted full custody of the children. Not long after, their youngest brother, Joe, was placed in foster care. The three brothers wouldn't see each other again for many years, a spark of music. Jimi Hendrix's love for music started when he was just a kid. Even in grade school, he was already pretending to be a guitarist, often seen carrying around a broomstick that he'd play while sitting on the edge of his bed, strumming away as if it were the real thing. Eventually, Jimi got his hands on an actual instrument, though not quite a full guitar. While helping his father clean out someone's house, he found a beat-up ukulele with only one string buried in a pile of junk. That didn't stop him. Jimi began teaching himself how to play by ear, using that single string to pluck out tunes he loved, like Elvis Presley's Hound Dog. At 15, he finally bought his first acoustic guitar. It was made for a right-handed player, but Jimi, being left-handed, didn't let that hold him back. Instead of restringing it, he simply flipped the guitar and played it upside down, a distinctive trait that would become part of his signature style for the rest of his life. How Lucille's death affected Jimi Hendrix. In 1958, the same year Jimi Hendrix got his first guitar, tragedy struck. His mother, Lucille, died after being found unconscious in an alley behind a bar. She was rushed to the hospital, but just a few hours later she passed away from a ruptured spleen. The exact cause of the injury was never fully explained, though her health had been deteriorating for some time due to cirrhosis of the liver brought on by years of heavy drinking. Her death was a devastating blow to both Jimi and his younger brother Leon. What made it even harder was their father Al's decision not to let them attend the funeral. That decision created a deep rift between the boys and their father, one that neither of them would ever fully forgive. In the aftermath, Hendrix turned to his guitar as both an escape and a way to cope with his grief. He poured himself into music, learning the songs of his blues idols by ear and skipping school to hang out with local musicians. For the first time in his life, he began to feel a sense of identity and confidence, found not in the chaos around him, but in the strings of his guitar. Uneasy beginnings for Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix's first steps into the music world weren't glamorous. They were gritty, improvised, and full of rejection. He began his career as a hired hand, playing wherever he could, often as a backup guitarist for local bands that needed someone who could fill in fast and play by ear. His very first performance took place in the basement of a Seattle synagogue, but it didn't go well. Hendrix's energetic stage presence, what would later become one of his trademarks, was a bit too much for the band. He was fired before the night was even over. Undeterred, Hendrix kept looking for opportunities and soon joined his first real group, the Velvetones. At the time, he still only had an acoustic guitar, and while he was a passionate player, the instrument just wasn't loud enough to keep up with the rest of the band. The sound got drowned out in every rehearsal and performance, frustrating both Hendrix and his bandmates. That changed in 1959 when his father, Al Hendrix, finally agreed to buy him his first electric guitar, a white Supro Ozark. It was a turning point. With an electric guitar in hand, Jimi's confidence grew, and so did the band's sound. The Velvetones evolved into the Rocking Teens, then became the Rocking Kings, and eventually morphed into a new group called Thomas and the Tomcats. The lineup changed often, and the gigs didn't pay. But Hendrix was cutting his teeth on stage, learning how to work a crowd and sharpen his skills. Just as things were gaining momentum, however, Hendrix's path was interrupted. In 1961, at the age of 18, he was arrested for joyriding in a stolen car. Faced with the choice between serving jail time or joining the U.S. Army, Hendrix chose the military. He was sent off to basic training, putting his rising music career on hold and launching him into a chapter of life that would prove just as turbulent and defining, at the mercy of the Screaming Eagles. Jimi Hendrix completed his basic training at Fort Ord in California, finishing the 8-week program before being assigned to the 101st Airborne Division and stationed at a base in Kentucky. But military life never quite fit him. True to his nature, Hendrix was a nonconformist, and his rebellious streak quickly became apparent. What stood out even more, though, was his relentless passion for the guitar. After settling in, Hendrix asked his father to send him his Silvertone Danelectro electric guitar. Once it arrived, he played it constantly, often late into the night. This didn't sit well with his fellow soldiers or superiors. His nightly playing drew complaints, and his guitar quickly became a target. Fellow troops would hide it from him, forcing Hendrix to plead for its return. Along with the teasing came verbal and physical bullying, making an already uncomfortable environment even worse. It wasn't long before Hendrix's lack of interest in the Army was officially noted. Just a few months in, his platoon sergeant filed a report stating that Hendrix had no motivation to be a soldier and recommended his discharge. A year later, his commanding officer followed through, and Hendrix was granted an honorable discharge, free to leave the military behind and finally pursue the music that had always been calling him. Jimi Hendrix had big fights with Little Richard. After leaving the Army, Jimi Hendrix returned to civilian life and threw himself fully into music. Throughout the early 1960s, he worked as a backing guitarist for some of the biggest names of the era, including Wilson Pickett, Sam Cooke, and Ike and Tina Turner. His talent was undeniable, even if he was still playing in the shadows. Eventually, he moved to Harlem and joined the Upsetters, the backing band for none other than Little Richard. It was a big opportunity, but not without friction. Hendrix, never one to blend in, quickly stood out with his flamboyant style and stage presence. While his guitar playing added fire to the show, it didn't sit well with Little Richard. The two clashed often, both on and off stage. According to Richard's brother, Robert Penniman, Hendrix had a habit of showing up late for the tour bus and charming all the women. He was always flirting with all the girls and stuff like that, Penniman recalled. Eventually, in 1965, Hendrix was let go from the band. But that setback proved to be a turning point. Just a year later, in 1966, Hendrix was discovered by producer Chaz Chandler of The Animals. Chandler saw something extraordinary in him and offered to manage and produce his work. Not long after, the Jimi Hendrix Experience was formed, and with it, a legend was born. Jimi Hendrix was about to become a rock icon. Drugs, booze, and beatings. Jimi Hendrix's name has long been tied to the drug-fueled counterculture of the 1960s, and not without reason. During the height of his career, Hendrix experimented with LSD, cannabis, hashish, and a variety of other substances. Like his parents before him, he also struggled with alcohol. The wild, high-pressure world of rock stardom offered endless chances to indulge, and Hendrix often did. But the fallout from those choices didn't affect only him. The same demons that haunted his family also cast a shadow over the women in his life. Friends and insiders have spoken about a darker side to Hendrix, one that emerged when he drank. Eric Burden, a close friend and fellow musician, once said, "One minute he's on stage singing about the mass of underdogs in America, and the next he's kicking the hell out of some poor chick in a back alley." Stories of Hendrix's violent outbursts toward girlfriends and lovers were sadly not uncommon, and many who knew him pointed to alcohol as the trigger. Photographer and friend Herbie Worthington put it bluntly. After drinking, Jimi simply turned into a bastard. He was acquitted of drug possession in Canada. In May 1969, Jimi Hendrix arrived in Canada to play a concert for 10,000 fans. But the trip didn't go as planned. When he landed at the Toronto airport, customs agents discovered a bottle in his bag containing 3 packets of heroin and a pipe with traces of hashish. He was immediately arrested and charged with 2 counts of drug possession, each carrying a potential sentence of up to 7 years in prison. Hendrix was released on bail and allowed to leave the country, but he returned that December to stand trial, just 9 months before his death. Though it was considered a relatively minor case by modern standards, the trial lasted 3 days and drew significant media attention. On the stand, Hendrix claimed the drugs weren't his. According to his testimony, a fan had handed him the bottle at some point, and he had unknowingly tossed it into his luggage without checking the contents. It might sound implausible today, but at the time, airport security was far less stringent. Passengers weren't routinely asked whether they had packed their bags themselves or if someone else had given them items. Hendrix also told the court, and repeated to a Canadian newspaper, that while he had experimented with drugs in the past, he had since left that part of his life behind. The statement wasn't entirely true. In fact, years later, a fan confessed that she and a friend had given Hendrix marijuana during that very trip to Canada. Still, after 8 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Not guilty. Hendrix walked free. But the arrest remained a sobering reminder of how fame, drugs, and pressure were beginning to weigh heavily on him. Hendrix didn't see his alleged children. Jimi Hendrix may have fathered 2 children, or perhaps none at all. What we do know is that 2 women who were romantically involved with him gave birth to children in the years before his death, and both claimed Hendrix was the father. Sadly, neither case was legally resolved before Hendrix passed away. The first child, Tamika James, was born on February 11, 1967. Her mother, Diane Carpenter, had toured with Hendrix the previous year. At the time, Diane was just 16. She didn't contact Hendrix about the child until Tamika was already 6 months old. Hendrix's response was uncertain. He neither fully accepted nor denied the possibility of being the father. But in the final year of his life, Carpenter and her attorneys were pushing harder for answers. They requested that Hendrix take a blood test to establish paternity. Meetings were held in May and June of 1970, and Hendrix reportedly discussed the matter with his own lawyer just 3 days before his death. But the test was never completed. As a result, Tamika was not legally recognized as his child and was excluded from inheriting any part of his estate. The second case involves James Sundquist, born in October 1969. His mother, Ava Sundquist, had a brief encounter with Hendrix during a visit to Sweden. Despite the short nature of their relationship, a Swedish court later ruled that Hendrix was the father. However, because no paternity test was ever conducted, the ruling holds no legal weight in the United States. Hendrix died less than a year after James was born and never met the child. He was juggling many girlfriends. In the year leading up to his death, Jimi Hendrix had several women in his life, each of them playing a role in his final chapter. One of them was Monica Dannemann, the woman who spent the last days with him and ultimately found him unresponsive on the morning he died. Just days earlier, Hendrix had also reconnected with model Linda Keith, a former Flame who had played a key part in his early career. He gifted her an expensive guitar during their reunion. That final year was marked by a whirlwind of relationships. Hendrix also spent time with Kirsten Nefer, Devin Wilson, and Carmen Barrero. Some of the women knew about each other. Nefer, for instance, overheard a tense phone call between Hendrix and Wilson, in which they argued over their relationship. In an almost surreal twist, Hendrix appeared to have proposed to 3 of these women within that single year. On Christmas 1969, he gave Carmen Barrero an engagement ring. He then asked both Kirsten Nefer and Monica Dannemann to marry him in the final week of his life. Of the 3, only Dannemann seemed to believe he truly intended to follow through. And yet, despite all of these relationships, Hendrix seemed to carry a lingering affection for his ex-girlfriend Kathy Etchingham. She was reportedly the only woman who wasn't interested in him for his fame or fortune. Even after their breakup in 1969, Hendrix would call her when he was feeling low, and his team would often reach out to her to help calm him down during moments of stress. In March 1970, he even flew to London and tried to persuade her to leave her new husband. On the very day he died, he had invited Kathy to join him at his hotel, but she never went. The decline of Jimi Hendrix. Fame was starting to wear Jimi Hendrix down. By the late 1960s, the pressure and chaos of his life were becoming too much. In New York, things were already unraveling. He'd gotten on the wrong side of some dangerous people linked to his manager, and tensions were running high. Looking for an escape, Hendrix headed to Europe, hoping a tour might offer some peace. "New York's killing me at the moment," he admitted to a journalist. But Europe didn't bring relief. Exhausted and emotionally drained, Hendrix made a chilling comment during a show in Denmark, telling the audience, "I've been dead a long time." Everything reached a breaking point at a music festival in Germany. Concerned about the risk of being electrocuted on a rain-soaked stage, Hendrix initially refused to perform. When he did finally appear, visibly intoxicated, he was met with boos from the crowd instead of applause. The chaos only escalated. By the time the night was over, the Hells Angels, who had been hired for security, had set fire to the stage, shot a roadie, and assaulted Hendrix's tour manager. That disastrous night would mark the end. It was the final show Jimi Hendrix would ever play. Jimi Hendrix died in London. On the night of September 17, 1970, Jimi Hendrix spent the evening partying with friends before returning to his London flat with his girlfriend, Monica Danneman. The two stayed up late, drinking red wine and talking into the early hours. At some point during the night, Hendrix took several of Danneman's sleeping pills, 9 tablets in total, nearly 20 times the recommended dose. The next morning, Monica found him unresponsive, lying in bed and covered in vomit. Despite emergency efforts, Hendrix was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was ruled asphyxiation. He had choked in his sleep. Since then, numerous conspiracy theories have surrounded his untimely death. Some claimed Hendrix died due to negligence by paramedics. Others suspected foul play by Danneman, or even suicide. One of the most persistent rumors accused his manager of orchestrating his death. But despite all the speculation, no concrete evidence has ever confirmed any of these theories. Jimi Hendrix was laid to rest in his hometown of Seattle, following a private ceremony attended by close friends and family, a quiet farewell to one of music's loudest and most legendary voices. Jimi Hendrix's abandoned home in London. This unassuming house in London holds a remarkable piece of rock history. On the upper floors of 23 Brook Street, Jimi Hendrix lived with his then-girlfriend Kathy Etchingham during 1968 and 1969. For Hendrix, it wasn't just another flat, it was, in his words, his first real home. He took great pride in decorating the space, adding personal touches with cushions and curtains from the John Lewis department store and vintage finds from the Portobello Road Market. By then, Hendrix had already skyrocketed to fame under the management of Chas Chandler, formerly the bassist for The Animals. Within months, the Jimi Hendrix Experience had landed 3 UK top 10 hits. Photographs from the time show Hendrix and Kathy inside their London apartment, surrounded by bold patterns and unmistakably 1960s decor. The vibe was a far cry from the residence right next door, once home to the iconic composer George Frideric Handel, who lived at 25 Brook Street for over 3 decades. After Hendrix's death, the flat changed hands several times and was eventually used as an office. But in 2000, the Handel House Trust took over, and by 2014, they began the careful process of restoring the Hendrix flat to how it looked during his time there. Since 2016, fans have been able to step inside and experience the space just as Hendrix did. Jimi Hendrix's life was a whirlwind of genius, pain, and unforgettable music, a story that echoes through the walls of the home he once called his sanctuary. What surprised you most about Jimi Hendrix's story, his abandoned home, the estate battle, or the tragedy of his final days? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the lives of music legends like Hendrix, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.